Terrific. We're going to need to transition. I want to thank our speakers, Manuel, Catherine, and Lisa, and of course, Kelly, for facilitating. And unfortunately, we're out of time. And I want to now shift. We'll have about 1 minute to transition over to our third session for this morning's session, Sustainable Livelihoods and Human Health Through Tourism. So I want to introduce Dr. Sue Snyman, our facilitator for our next session. So Sue, you there? Take it away.
Thanks so much, Gregory, and welcome everyone to our third and final session of this first event. I hope that you have had a wonderful time so far and really enjoyed it. There is really an emerging body of evidence that tourism in and around protected areas elevates human well-being, including higher wealth levels, a reduction in poverty, and health benefits. This panel is going to explore the underlying body of research and nature-based tourism models to achieve the best outcomes in this regard. Please do add your questions in the Q&A as you have been doing, and any general comments into the chat. And up first, we're going to hear from Robin Naidu, who is a senior conservation scientist and lead wildlife scientist for the World Wildlife Fund. Take it away, Robin.
Thanks very much, Sue, and good morning, everyone from the west coast of Canada. I'm really pleased to be here to talk to you today about human well-being impacts in protected areas across the developing world. And obviously, you know, the relevance to this session is that, as we know, protected areas are typically, you know, a hub for nature-based tourism around the world. So the academic background to this study was the question that we find in the literature, maybe somewhat surprising to this audience, is, you know, are protected areas good or bad for local people? And, you know, those who cite evidence that it's good suggest reasons like protected areas provide better environmental quality to local people. There's the obvious opportunities from tourism. And for reasons like this, protected areas are good for the people who live nearby. On the other hand, there's a significant body of folks who suggest that protected areas are bad for people who live nearby. And they're bad because they restrict access to resources, they increase human-wildlife conflict, they've historically displaced people. And so for those reasons, protected areas are typically bad for local people. The problem is to make any general insights on this body of work is nearly impossible. And that's because these studies use different methods. They occur in different geographical locations with different socioeconomic contexts. They measure different well-being outcomes at different timescales. And ultimately, recent reviews have concluded that the evidence base is so thin that only 1% to 8% of studies in this body of literature use rigorous methods and data to examine the well-being impacts of PAs, protected areas, on local people. And, you know, of course, this is nonetheless an extremely critical question to answer, particularly in the context of proposed global protected area expansion. So we know that the world just missed its Aichi target that came and went in 2020, but post 2020, we're talking about much more ambitious levels of protection across the world. Many of you will have heard of the 30 by 30 initiative. And so it's really important that we understand what kind of effect this protected area expansion is going to have on other sustainable development goals like poverty alleviation. Is it likely to help poverty alleviation, or is it likely to hinder that goal? So what we wanted to do is really advance this, this field by conducting a quantitative analysis of protected area impacts. And what we wanted to do is generate a consistent database across multiple countries and protected areas, so not restricting ourselves to one particular case study. We wanted to recognize that human well-being depends on many factors, including but not limited to environmental conditions. And we wanted to use rigorous and quantitative methods to assess the impacts of protected areas on local human well-being, while also controlling for many confounding factors. So how did we go about doing this? First, we generated a new comprehensive international database that was based on information from the Demographic and Health Surveys, which is a fantastic program that surveys thousands, tens of thousands of people across the developing world. Rather, all of this data is freely available, and they consist of household surveys that ask really detailed questions on socioeconomic status, livelihoods, health, and so forth. So we harnessed those data. The great thing about those data is that they're also geo-referenced, so they have a GPS point associated with it. So we extracted environmental information at all of these DHS sampling locations. And then we used a world database on protected areas and calculated the distance of each of those DHS sampling areas to the nearest protected area. And we considered all households within a 10-kilometer distance to be near a protected area, although we tested the sensitivity of our results to that threshold. So this is what the data set looks like in terms of a map. So we can see that although this is not a wall-to-wall complete sort of global data set, it does cover a big part of the tropical developing world. What we're looking at, the blue points represent DHS sampling locations that are further than 10 kilometers from a protected area. The red points represent DHS sampling clusters that are within 10 kilometers, and protected areas are in green polygons. And so again, this isn't wall-to-wall global coverage, but it's certainly a massive data set and includes information on 87,000 children in 60,000 households and over 600 protected areas. So by far the largest quantitative data set that has been brought to bear on this question. So how did we wrangle with this huge amount of data? We took a statistical modeling approach that recognized that households near protected areas are likely to be systematically different than those further away from protected areas. And that's because, as we know, protected areas aren't randomly placed on the landscape, but they tend to be placed in areas that are far from urban centers with low road densities at higher elevation and in less agriculturally productive areas. And all of those things are also likely to influence human well-being and therefore be confounded with any possible protected area impact. So we wanted to control for that. We used a statistical technique called matching. I won't get into the details here, but essentially the concept is that we want to create a control group, much like an experiment. We want to create a control group of people. And so compare households that are near protected areas with households that are further away from protected areas, but that are otherwise similar in important respects that might confound our results. And we looked at 4 different well-being outcomes. So this was obviously just a small sample of well-being outcomes, but this is what we had available to us in this data set. So 2 were related to wealth. So a continuous score regarding the household wealth level, and then whether that household could be considered to be in poverty or not based on an international threshold. And then with regard to children, and specifically children under 5, a continuous childhood growth score that's related to height, to age, and then whether that child considered to be stunting, again, based on international thresholds. And of course, stunting is something that's extremely important and has implications that cascade into adulthood, so that go well beyond the current status of a child under the age of 5. And there were specific pathways that we wanted to test. And one of the key ones is related to tourism. And so, we conceptualized that protected areas obviously often have tourism associated with them. That tourism sector can lead to infrastructure springing up around protected areas. So better roads, more health clinics, and both of those can lead to better health outcomes of people who live near those protected areas. And then another pathway is that, as we know, again, the tourism sector at protected areas can often provide jobs to local people in the form of working at lodges or as guides. That additional income can be spent on health outcomes or can be invested in household assets and lead to increased wealth levels. So this was a key pathway related to tourism. It's not the only pathway, so there are other ways in which protected areas can improve human well-being, but I won't dwell on those at the moment. So what did we find? This chart is going to show you the results. On the x-axis, we've got improvement relative to baseline, and by baseline, that includes this comparison group.
Robin.
Thanks. Comparison group of people who are living further away from protected areas, but that are otherwise similar. And what we see in the first instance is that strict protected areas essentially have no effect on people. They're not good for the well-being of local people, but nor are they bad, which is a key result. And then as we go up to these other types of protected areas, we see positive impacts. And if we focus on this type of protected areas, so multiple use protected areas, IUCN categories 5 and 6, that have some tourism, we can see that all of these well-being indicators here are statistically greater than zero, up to 25%, and actually well within the range of other types of interventions and characteristics that are more typically associated with development improvements or improvements in livelihoods. So whether someone lives in an urban area versus rural, whether a mother has breastfed their child, increased gains in education, we can see that with a few exceptions, these effects of living near a protected area are similar to these other types of interventions or characteristics. And so, just to conclude, I think this really provides us with some of the best evidence to date using, a comprehensive, widespread database that not only are protected areas not bad for people, but they can actually provide substantial benefits for people living nearby in terms of health and wealth outcomes. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Robin. Up next, we have Judy Kefagona, who is the Director and Lead Consultant for the Sustainable Travel and Tourism Agenda. Welcome, Judy.
Good evening from Nairobi, Kenya, and thanks for having me today to talk about community conserved areas in East Africa. I'm going to start by giving an overview of the community conserved areas in East Africa, also commonly known as conservancies. Conservancies is an evolving concept in East Africa. I must say, over the last 15 years, we have seen significant evolution of the concept in terms of the models of management, in terms of their approaches, in terms of their financing. And we have also seen a lot of entry of new players in this particular area. Another thing I want us to take note of is that conservancies in East Africa are categorized into three. You've got conservancies, community conservancies that are organized by a community that owns land together. In Kenya, we call this the group ranch model, which means there's a single title to a piece of land and community have decided to set it aside for tourism. Now here, the communal ownership of land is very, very important. We have another type of conservancy where land is privately owned by a number of landowners who live in a particular area, and they pool this land together and say they want to set it aside for conservation, and so they move out and set this land aside for conservation. Then we've got private individuals who have large tracts of land or families, particularly in the Laikipia area of Kenya, where these individuals or families decide that they want to use their land as conservancies. So we already see three key actors in the conservancy model in Kenya. We've got communities where land is communally owned. We've got landowners, because when we come to landowners, there could be landowners who are not members of that community, but they happen to have owned land during the land subdivision process or bought it after subdivision, and therefore they are landowners. So we have conservancies by landowners. We have conservancies by communities that are in indigenous, homogeneous communities. And then we have conservancies in Kenya that are private owned. So when we talk about communities and conservancies and well-being of and livelihoods of the communities, we have to look at them in those different angles. So if I start by looking at the perspectives around the whole model, we know that the conservancy model has many different actors around it. The key actors are normally the landowners, the communities, or the individuals who have set their land aside. But then we have government, who is the developer of policy, and then we have tourism investors. Why? Because one characteristic of community conservancies is that most of them are dependent on safari tourism, which means they depend on the daily rate that is paid at the gates by tourists who come to visit the conservation areas for purposes of tourism to earn revenue. So the revenue, there's a singular source of revenue that is earned directly out of this model. Now, if you look at all these actors, they all have a different way of interpreting what a conservancy is. If you ask a community member or a community landowner what a conservancy is, and this is based on a study that we did in 2018 out of the 3 most established conservancies in Masai Mara. And for the landowners and the community members, the conservancy was a land management model that is dependent on tourism because of the high biodiversity to bring revenue to the community. So land management is most important for the community member. If you look at a lot of literature, and if you look at the Wildlife Management and Coordination Act in Kenya, for example, it defines the conservancy as a conservation model. It looks at the conservancy as another conservation model aside from the national park that is state protected. So they see a conservation model where the community are the leaders. So it is a community-led a conservation model that uses tourism as a vehicle to generate revenue. And therefore it finds its way into the Tourism Act as well, because now it is seen as a destination. Communities don't see their conservancies as a destination. They see it more as a land management model that helps them to retain their land so that they can continue their traditional model practice livelihood of pastoralism, because these models allow access at different times of the year for pastoralism purposes. Then we have the tourism investors, who are big players in the conservancy movement or the model. The tourism players, when they look at the conservancy, they see a sustainable tourism development model. And in this sustainable tourism development model, they see themselves as operators who are supporting the sustainable development of tourism. If you look at the reports of tourism companies that operate in conservation areas, they will always refer to the conservancies as their contribution to sustainable development of tourism. They will be saying that by the virtue of the fact that we operate in these areas, we are supporting sustainable development of tourism. Now, these interpretations, these varying interpretations of conservancies in East Africa, because we also did a few conservancies in Tanzania, where it is totally different. There is heavy government engagement, even in what they're calling the community conserved areas. But we found out that this thinking, these 3 different levels of thinking was the same even in Tanzania. That's how the communities perceived the conservancies, how the tourism businesses perceived it, and how the policymakers and the conservation world perceived it was so different. Then we also have another group that has a perception of what the conservancy is. And this is what I call the social justice tourism group. These people who are the group that wants to see better tourism, that talks about ecotourism. So when they see, when this group looks at a conservancy, they see a tourism model, a tourism and conservation model that has the potential to be inclusive and to benefit host communities. And that is also a different perspective about conservancies. Now, what is the impact of these different perspectives on the conservancies? The impact of this different perspective on the conservancies. Thank you. The impact is that the conservancies are facing many vulnerabilities. And as I'm concluding, I'll just mention one. From the community's perspective, It means that the next generation of the children of the current landowners, their interpretation of land management, of the Conservancy being a land management model, has given them a chance to sell that land. They're seeing the value of the land and they want to sell it because it has gotten higher value out of protection. So the highest risk to the conservancies in East Africa today is the perception that this is a land management model, and therefore as the land increases value, you can take it to the market. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy. We are going to cross the ocean now from Kenya and head to Arizona, where we have our next speaker, Dr. Kelly Bricker, who is the professor and director of Hainan ASU Joint Tourism College at Arizona State University. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you so much, Sue. Pleasure to be here. And I'm going to share some thoughts on benefit sharing related to parks and protected areas, specifically on tourism. And this work comes out of a special issue that Sue and I did a couple of years ago. Next slide, please, Maddie. What we have learned from protected areas sustainable tourism is that over many years, it is significantly has the potential to not only intersect as a tool for conservation, but really is part of this larger system. It's people, it's places of each destination or region, and really part of a political and institutional framework where people offer amazing experiences for visitors and sometimes residents alike. The pandemic, however, is dramatically changing all of this and has caused a systemic shock with widespread implications. Protected areas are part of this socio-ecological system, and as such, communities living in and around protected areas are impacted. And when evaluating the relationship between a healthy planet and sustaining healthy people, communities, nations, and the intricacy of this vast web of interrelationships really becomes clear. Think of global climate change as an example. Next slide, please. Individual human beings can deliver health benefits to the planet, while a healthier planet can reciprocate through several ecosystem services, a few of which are shown here. These services fill not only fundamental biological needs, but also cultural and recreational, aesthetic, and spiritual well-being needs. People depend on the planet for medicines that originate from diverse types of ecosystems. And healthy ecosystems also help us understand disease, support the food web on which people depend, and reduce the risk of contracting infectious diseases. Next slide, please. For the purposes of this presentation, benefit sharing is defined as a commitment to channel some returns, whether monetary or non-monetary, back to the range of designated participants, affected communities, source communities, or source nations. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. These benefits can include both tangible and intangible benefits, ranging from direct financial benefits from protected areas to the ability to use natural resources within protected areas to ecosystem services resulting from the conservation of these protected areas. Next slide, please. Yet many of these benefits are difficult to measure and are often even more challenging to communicate to those living in and around a protected area. Next slide. And as research has shown, that even the communication and measure of tangible financial benefits from, for example, tourism in protected areas is on sometimes an ad hoc basis, with many governments being unaware of the total contribution of their economies. Next slide. While some communities engaged in protected area tourism, especially here in the United States, often referred to as gateway or amenity communities, might secure financial benefits from outdoor tourism and recreation industries, benefits may also be severely decreased due to overcrowding, air pollution, water scarcity, or unplanned development just to name a few. Next slide. Next slide. And equally disconcerting, are communities significantly dependent upon protected area international tourism dollars may find their economies in collapse, as we heard about, due to their significant dependence on protected area tourism. There's no doubt we have witnessed these varying challenges throughout the last couple of years. Next slide, please. While the number and size of protected areas has been increasing, the funding that is available to manage them has remained generally stagnant, and in many cases has declined, resulting in significant shortfalls and insufficient means to ensure effective achievement of conservation and livelihood goals. And the pandemic, once again, has exacerbated this situation. Funding shortfalls have highlighted a potential challenge for protected areas in terms of benefit sharing, especially with local communities. If protected areas are unable to fund necessary operational expenses, how will they then share benefits, particularly financial benefits, with those living on the edge? To ensure protected areas are effectively managed through appropriate levels of funding, innovative and creative mechanisms to support funding are really needed. While we have seen protected area tourism, if well managed, contribute to this shortfall somewhat, we have all seen that some level of insurance support is needed during times of crisis, such as COVID-19. Next slide, please. Benefit sharing from protected area asks us to ensure equity in thinking about the long-term benefits of protected area tourism. This likely involves intense consideration of governance, which includes decision-making and power structures, relationships, and accountability. Next slide, please. And equally critical is an understanding of the local community dynamics, hierarchies, and power sharing, which are essential to ensure the most marginalized, most impoverished are included in benefit sharing mechanisms within communities. Therefore, for stakeholders, consultation, joint decision-making, and advocacy are all necessary for equity to be realized. Next slide, please. And beyond the most notable economic and employment direct benefits of protected area tourism, we also know that successful benefit sharing programs include ongoing training, education, and other forms of capacity building that are designed around the needs of the community. Whereas lack of such empowerment and engagement may actually impede ways in which benefit sharing can address localized changes. Next slide, please. Increasingly, next slide, please. Increasingly evident is that well-structured partnerships, agreements, and governance structures with transparent benefit sharing processes provides opportunities for communities to connect to economic benefits and employment opportunities. While there are vast differences in these types of agreements, common to all must be a transparent structure of engagement and procedures for fair distribution of these opportunities. Next slide, please. Understanding particularly community needs is also essential to understand the benefit sharing mechanisms or processes. And while economic benefits have been shown as critical, there are multiple ways in which these benefits may be fulfilled. As a framework for understanding complex systems, researchers have suggested both tangible revenue, economic returns, infrastructure, health, and ecological, as well as intangible aspects of communities, such as empowerment, psychological, social, and political, and that these are considered and influence the effectiveness of benefit sharing in tourism development. With such an emphasis on revenue generation, poverty alleviation, next slide please, and various forms of capacity building, benefit sharing is a complex interaction which deserves increased attention. For example, consider the opportunity for significant innovation at policy level, which in turn may have significant implications at the community level. Next slide, please. Governments could consider tax incentives and support for schemes for tourism enterprises that demonstrate increased benefit sharing structures and programs, and for those tourism enterprises that contribute to the protection of biodiversity and build capacity in communities living on the edge of protected areas, incentive programs, tax or otherwise, could be implemented. Adaptive co-management of protected areas may be a way to address the intractable challenges facing protected areas and sustainable tourism, such as conflict, complexity, and uncertainty. With co-management structures, there may be increased opportunities for local empowerment and innovation, positive perceptions of engagement, perceived control, and sustainable behaviors. While specific research on co-management of tourism in protected areas is really sparse, there is some indication of positive benefits because of a level of participation by communities, including equitable benefit distribution and relatively high levels of communication. So recently, in thinking of ways to ensure resilience in times of crisis, such as COVID, Ayers and Launer have suggested novel funding opportunities that could benefit communities and protected areas in crisis, such as diversifying income streams, reducing sole reliance on protected area tourism, implementing novel funding opportunities such as 401ks for nature, endowments or emergency funds, or something like a COVID tourism tax. In addition,
1 minute, Kelly.
Thank you. In addition, we have seen some destinations, next slide, please, take advantage of opportunities to bolster regional tourism, virtual tourism, as well as using skill sets of tourism operators for community good, such as rural vaccination programs and emergency management services. Next slide, please. Research and programs have taught us that active institutional structures and support, the establishment of good governance policies and practices, and clear benefit distribution plans, community engagement, empowerment, all play a role in addressing the challenges and promoting a more positive and sustainable benefit sharing model. Thank you. Next slide, please. Very much.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Up next, we have Teresa Pastor, who is the Project Development and ECST Manager from Europark. Welcome, Teresa, over to you.
Good evening, can you hear me? And can you see my screen?
We can, thank you, Teresa.
Okay, so good evening from Barcelona. I'm working for the Europark Federation, which is the largest association of protected areas in Europe. And I'm going to introduce briefly the capacity building program that we have to maximize benefits from tourism in parks. So Europark, we have a management tool to manage sustainable tourism. We have been very successful already for over 20 years. And the key part of this management tool is working in partnership. To do that, it is needed the creation of a sustainable tourism forum in which all relevant stakeholders are involved, that is communities, the authorities, and also the tourist business. They work together in order to produce a common sustainable tourism strategy and action plan. Of course, working, involving different types of people is not an easy task. You need to have very good communication and negotiation skills. This is why from Europark, we organized a first online course on communication and stakeholders involvement. Sorry, don't know how to pass the. Sorry for that, because I don't know what's going on. But,
if you click on this slide, Teresa, just on.
Oh, yes, here. Okay,
yeah.
Now, okay. So in this course, which is online course based on the Moodle platform, it's part of a European project, we specified the different parts of a communication strategy, putting a lot of attention on how to identify, understand, and communicate with the stakeholders. Of course, we also talk about objectives and channels and tools and implementation of the communication strategy and how to validate it. In this course, we also provide personal communication competencies, which are at the core of a good communication, with competencies such as active listening and effective questioning, universal emotions and nonverbal communication, and negotiation and conflict resolution. Also, we have delivered another online course to help managers to implement the action and strategy for tourist sustainable in their parks. This course is also delivered in the Moodle platform. It's part of another European project, the Sustainable Tourism Training for Tomorrow project. It's a free course, which is available in English, French, Spanish, and Italian. And it's composed of 9 different modules, which focus on all the different important tasks and actions that such a plan should include. The first module focus on landscape and biodiversity heritage. The second one focus on conservation through tourism, with such actions such as encouraging tourists to deliver donations, for example, or to engage in volunteering activities. The third module focus on reducing impacts, with reducing the carbon footprint, pollution. The fourth module focus on accessibility and facilities, with a special focus with people with special needs. The fifth module focus on effective visitor communication, so how to communicate the park to visitors. The sixth module focus on social cohesion. The seventh module focus on ensuring prosperity to the local communities. The eighth module focus on monitoring the impact of tourism. And the ninth module focus on communication and shelter engagement. All these modules can be followed independently, one from another one. And at the end of each module, there's a quiz. And if successfully passed, you can get a certificate. If you are interested in following this course, you just tap in your browser, Sustainable Tourism Training for Tomorrow, and you will be directed to it. Finally, we are also working on the production of a pedagogical toolkit addressed to sport trainers. The object is to provide the trainers who are going to train visitors and tourists in the outdoors recreation, outdoor sports, to provide them with pedagogical tools in order to introduce sustainability and to minimize the impact that these outdoor sports may have in protected areas and in nature in general. So we have already identified for individual sports, mountain sports such as hiking, orienteering, mountain biking, water sports such as kayaking or sailing, and winter sports such as snow skiing. So we have already identified the main impacts these sports exert in the protected areas, such as disturbance to wildlife, overcrowding, littering, and now we are in the process of developing this pedagogical tool with educational elements that can be done on the field. Of course, continuous improvement is key to have to deliver a sustainable destination. So this is why we need to adapt to the new times, to the new situation, and now we are living special times, of course, with not only because of the pandemic, but also because of the climate and biodiversity crisis. So We have new situations. We need new capacities to be built on. So at least in Europe, we have detected, or we have had a high increase of visitors in protected areas, but with especially with a new profile of visitors. So we are getting more local and domestic tourists, more families with children. Has been an increase of the use of private car, and many of these newcomers are not so familiar with the park regulations. So managers that are dealing with the promotion of tourism, sustainable tourism in their parks need to improve other skills to get new capacities. So from Europark, we will like to work now on providing capacities on the promotion of creative and innovative thinking, so to be ready to find new solutions to all these new situations, to know better the different type of visitors and their real needs. It's not the same family that experienced hiker. To manage large influx of visitors, specifically in specific parts of parks. To have a sustainable mindset, to introduce sustainability in all aspects, in all services provided by the park, to provide effective communication and to use real-time technologies that are currently available. And of course, to cooperate and work in partnership, because this is key to deliver sustainable destinations.
Teresa, 1 minute.
Yeah, so as I said, continuous improvement is key for sustainability. And this is what Europark helps managers to do by providing networking opportunities, by organizing exchanges, by organizing webinars, by organizing this kind of capacity building tools that I have just presented to you. And I leave here my contact name and my email address. If someone wants to further inquiries, please write to me. And I invite you to visit our website, where you will find all these tools. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa, Kelly, Judy, and Robin, for your wonderful observations on this intersection between protected areas, tourism, and livelihoods. We have a number of great questions, and so we'll dive right into them. Our first question is to Robin. Is there a critical size or relationship with the size of protected areas to have a substantive influence on local economies and households? A good example is the small island developed states in the Eastern Caribbean, where the protected areas may only be 10 hectares. Robin?
Yeah, thanks, Jim, and thanks for that question. And I guess the two answers. The short answer is we didn't examine that specifically in our study, even though we could have. So, we do have information on the size of protected areas, but we didn't explicitly consider that in our well-being simulation. So I can't say anything quantitative from our results on that front. I guess speculating, I could imagine that smaller protected areas, could provide those benefits because, from a tourism point of view, I guess, the benefits are a function of, where the specific job opportunities and infrastructure associated with tourism might arise. And in a smaller protected area, that's likely to be more focused. And so there's less chance that, in a larger protected area where you've got those kind of things spread out and diffuse, and they simply may not coincide with where people are living. So, but that is pure speculation, and we didn't examine specifically the size implications of protected areas in terms of our well-being impacts.
And relatedly, another individual asked the question, is there a minimum sample size in terms of the population surveyed?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, we use these existing demographic and health surveys for our work. So we didn't go out ourselves and and sort of conduct these studies. And if we had, we might have done it differently. But of course, it's extremely difficult to do that across 34 countries and all of these different protected areas. So, I think it does bring up the point. I saw that question was also asking about the sort of temporal nature, the sort of the influence of time. And that's something that our study didn't deal with, but I think it would be great to do this in particular locations. So to really track well-being outcomes over time so that we can see how, positive, potential positive impacts of protected areas sort of cascade through time from park establishment and going forward. So we weren't able to do that in our study, but I think it would be very useful to do that in particular places.
And we have a question, actually, there are two questions, and this is for Judy. For the conservancies, there are obviously different models in terms of who puts up the upfront capital and revenue sharing and the management of those of the tourism properties and experiences. In your experience, which of the different models do you believe are the most successful, not only in the good times, but in the not so good times, such as we're experiencing right now?
And unfortunately, my internet just dropped when you were asking me the question.
Oh.
And so I only got the last bit of the question.
Okay.
I hope it is enough now. It is
Okay.
back.
Okay, very, very quickly. There are a number of different conservancy models in terms of who puts up the upfront capital, who manages the tourism properties and experiences. And which model, I mean, from your perspective, which models do you feel are the most successful, not only in the good times or the bad times, in terms of benefiting communities?
I think, like I mentioned, that the conservancy models are evolving. What we have learned from Kenya is that different models work for different places. And like I mentioned at the end of my presentation, the land management model is very, very important for the success of any conservancy in Kenya. If the land is not secure and protected, it doesn't matter what else you have, because then that land is vulnerable. It can change uses at any given time, and it can change owners at any given time. So the only constant that makes a conservancy successful in East Africa today is that the land has got to be secured. Today, the land in conservancies is secured using ordinary land management security, which means you register the title and put a caveat in the title that this land is now under protection and it can't be sold. From our experiences in conservancies in Masai Mara, you can still go to court and say that I now want to use this land. I have much need for it than conservation. And the law can actually, the courts can actually grant you alternative use for that particular land. So the only constant for success in the conservancy model today is the protection of the land. Without that, it doesn't matter which kind of tourism business is there, how responsible they are, how committed the community is, how much donor funding has been pumped in, that will not save the land if the land protection model is not the right one.
Right. Follow-up. In terms of the financial and health and education benefits and revenue sharing from the tourism income revenues that, let's say, that occur on the land, which are the models do you think yield the best benefits for the people?
Jim, was that question for me?
No, that was for Judy. For Judy
Right.
again, the follow-up question.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. I thought that was for
Sorry.
Yeah. In terms of benefits for the community, if we are talking about, I'm trying to avoid the use of the term best model because we are going through an evolution. And at any given time, 15 years ago, there was a best model where land was set aside landowners were paid a fixed monthly income, and the land was then registered and protected. 15 years later, we are seeing quite a mix of that, where landowners now want to be investors. They don't just want to be paid for setting aside their land. They now want to earn equity. They're like, okay, what is the value of this conservancy? What is the equity? If it's going to be an equitable model, we don't want to be paid some fixed rates for the parcels of land that we have put in. We now want to understand the entire value of the land plus the biodiversity in it and its accrued value over time, and we want a share of it. And they're now talking about, do we get 75% share and the investors get 25%? These are discussions that are now emerging in 2021, especially after the COVID crisis, that actually showed that the conservancy models were so vulnerable because by May 2020, landowners were on 50%, well, actually they were on zero for 3 months, and then it went to 50% of the rate that they were receiving because donors quickly came in and supplemented their conservancy income. Without donor funding, the landowners in the current model would have been at zero income for the entire of 2020 and 2021, which has been heavily supplemented by donor funding. Now, that kind of funding is not sustainable for the conservancies today. A different innovative financing model has to be found. And that is why now the questions of equity are being discussed so that conservancies can have reserves. The model that we have today does not allow for conservancies to have reserve. So we've had a lot of learning models. We don't have best models. We've got working models. And all of them, whether it comes to benefit sharing with communities, whether it comes to, we're talking about access to financial finances from different sources, whether we're talking about biodiversity protection, all these models are emerging. And every other 5 years, I have seen significant changes, right from mindsets of landowners, what they were when we first saw the first conservancy in Masai Mara 20 years ago. That landowner is not the same landowner today. They're thinking very differently. They're asking very different questions than they asked 15 years ago. And so what was great for them in 2006, it's not as valuable today. And that is why they're talking more and more of equity, and they're talking about shareholding today. They want to be shareholders in the businesses. They want to own the businesses and have operators come in and operate on management leases. They are thinking, and it is also because the first generation that signed leases for conservancies in Kenya is different. Somebody who was 20 years when their parents signed into the conservancy is now 45, and they're the ones in charge, and they have gone to school, and they're telling their parents, no, we can't continue like this. We have to have different value. We have to start thinking about this land very differently. It's no longer agricultural land. It is now economic. It is land with economic value. It is no longer pastoralist land that is looked at in terms of how much cattle it would hold and how much maize will be grown on it as an alternative, because that was the basis of calculating what the landowners get. The 45-year-old who was 20 years then is saying to everybody, including the donors, that we are thinking differently about this land. They are calculating carbon and saying, what will be the equivalent? What about if we left it aside and there was no tourism and we just used them as carbon sinks? What will be the value that we will get out of it? Is tourism giving us good value for money? For the first time, landowners are questioning the value of tourism. In 2006, it seemed like it was the only vehicle that will be used by conservancy. Today, they are questioning the value of tourism. They're asking, are there alternatives to tourism that can bring value to this land?
Thank you, Judy. And for the rest of the panelists, this brings up the questions during the pandemic. Many individuals and organizations have asked the question: should we be investing more in other or diversifying other activities in and around protected areas to diversify revenue streams other than tourism? So I will open up the floor to any of you to give your thoughts on that question.
I'm happy to jump in for a second. I absolutely believe that diversity, we know biodiversity is critical for a healthy planet, and I think economic diversity is critical for a healthy community. And that diversity could come, our example in Fiji is when tourism totally stopped, farmers were able to go back to their fields and still provide not only subsistence, but commercial value agriculture to their communities during a pandemic. The skill sets that are used, I think, are really important. They can be transferred to reaching rural communities for vaccination programs. So I think diversity and thinking about the skill sets and the capacity that's being built within a community is really important.
Okay. One final question for any of you. I mean, historically, government aid organizations, international finance institutions, foundations have really not comprehended fully the connection between protected areas, tourism, and livelihoods. Do any of you have any thoughts in terms of how to build the best case to prompt these organizations to invest more in what I like to call conservation travel or conservation tourism and its benefits to livelihoods?
I can just offer my quick perspective, Jim. And, I think I alluded to this in my talk that, the literature to date has largely been composed of case studies in particular places. So, you can see some benefits happening over here with Kenyan conservancies, but those might be different than Namibian conservancies, and these, all of those things will operate differently than in Fiji, where Kelly was mentioning, or in Europe, where Teresa was talking about it. And then it becomes a situation where everyone can kind of pick something from somewhere and say, well, this is what's happening. And it's very difficult to sort of generalize about these impacts. And so, I think the case studies are critically important because they kind of flesh out, things in any one particular area that is difficult to do with a sort of more generalized average type of effect, like the study I talked about mentioned. But I do think it is important to talk about those average effects using the best available data, because that does provide sort of some more general guidance to policymakers and funders. So I guess those are my quick thoughts.
It does seem, if we couched, all of these issues, which are really being pinpointed in today's crisis, right? Health and well-being, really contribution to the SDGs, thinking about on a broader scale the health and well-being benefits, that does seem to resonate with lawmakers and institutions, and sort of heading towards that goal of sustainable development in all facets that are demonstrated by the SDGs.
Just to add on that, I think when we get to a point where conservancies can have the voice to speak on and present their needs, then probably the approach to funding is going to change, because then conservancies will be presenting their understanding of the value of the conservancy. Today, like I mentioned earlier on, the different interpretations of the conservancy are interest interpretations. Everybody is interpreting the conservancy based on their interests, and that interest will drive how they engage with the conservancy, and it has also affected how conservancies receive their funding from many different organizations. Now, unfortunately, much of this funding in Eastern Africa is what I call very opportunistic. It is opportunistic in the way, in this way. It is opportunistic because the funding addresses an interest of the funder most of the time. This is what we like. The Conservancy has these 10 problems. We know that problem number 10 is the one that will kill or the Conservancy, or it's dependent, the life of the Conservancy is dependent on it. But because we want to address problem number 3, we will still put our money in problem number 3 and ignore problem number 10. So it's very opportunistic, and that is why it is not helping the conservancies, and that's why nobody wants to talk. All these funders don't want to talk to each other because everybody has an interest that they want to protect, and the conservancies are not yet strong enough to come out to say that, you know what, if you want to talk to us, we are now addressing SDG number 5, and that is where all our funding is going to.
Well, thank you all. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, and I want to thank you for your very excellent observations on this challenging topic, not only the challenges, but also the opportunities that lie ahead. This will bring us to a close for our first session, and then we will all return back in about 6 hours from now for another group of individuals and sessions that are completely different from this, from the first session on, and it will be visitation and biodiversity conservation in protected areas and how COVID has impacted those areas. The impact of the return of tourism, especially in those areas where COVID vaccinations have accelerated, and the over-tourism issues associated with that. And then lastly, sustainable tourism blueprints and solutions. So we want to thank you and hope you were inspired by today's first session, and we hope to see you back for the second. Thank you very much.